Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Well, welcome everybody to episode 6 of Espresso Martini with myself, Chris Carr, and Matt Fulton. Matt, welcome. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. How are you? Feeling better?
Yeah, I'm good. I'd say about 95% better. I still got 5% of sniffles left. I had my last antibiotic today. Had a mild case of bronchitis, which was brought along by a cold that was given to me by a friend of mine, who I went to meet with a couple of weeks ago. They very kindly gave me their cold. So yeah, so that was a bit of a nightmare. I've been existing on 2 hours sleep for a few weeks. Now I'm a lot better. I can sleep again, which is a big improvement, and I think my voice has pretty much come back to how it usually is. So yeah,
good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I suppose before we kick off, so Matt, you are now doing some interviews for the podcast, which I'm very grateful for. And you just had a brilliant one with Shane Harris that will be coming out next week. What can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I yesterday spoke with Shane Harris of the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize winning Shane Harris. And we talked about some of his recent reporting on the Nord Stream pipeline bombing. This happened September 26th of 2002, so we're 6 months removed now, and we're still not able to sort of conclusively say who was responsible. When the bombing first happened, everyone, in the U.S. and Europe sort of instantly said it was the Russians. The Russians denied it, and over the course of those few months, no real evidence, no hard evidence bubbled up that would indicate the Russians. And it's been sort of a mystery since then. But recently, some new intelligence came to light, and there's some officials in the U.S. and Germany who suspect that a group of pro-Ukrainian partisans may have attacked the pipeline. So I talked with Shane about his reporting on that issue. It's a pretty cool interview.
Excellent. Interesting you mentioned partisans, because we're going to talk about Belarus a bit later, and there's some Belarusian partisans who were involved in attacking a Russian AWACS plane. So it definitely seems to be a kind of growing thing, this, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't want to spoil the interview too much, but the prospects, if it does pan out, that a pro-Ukrainian group, again, not the Ukrainian security services, not the Ukrainian government, but a pro-Ukrainian group was responsible. It could be quite a tricky situation. I mean, President Zelensky is incredibly dependent on economic intelligence, military support from the West, and here you have a pro-Ukrainian group that blew up a pipeline in the exclusive economic zone of Denmark and Sweden. So that's, not good for a country that has aspirations to join the EU and possibly NATO in the future. So it could complicate things a bit if that pans out.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to listening to that next week, and I hope everybody else does too. But so well done for doing that.
Thanks.
So today we have yet another jam-packed episode. February, like January, was also a busy month in the world of espionage, geopolitics, and intrigue, which is our area. So we have a few topics that we wish to look at, from President Joe Biden's historic trip to Ukraine through to the CIA Director William Burns visiting various leaders in Libya. So we'll kick off with President Biden's trip to Ukraine. So we're looking at the article Biden's Surreal and Secretive Journey into a War Zone by Peter Baker and Michael D. Shear from the New York Times. And I'll just go through some key points and then I'll come to you, Matt. So to mark the first anniversary of Russia's war on Ukraine, United States President Joe Biden bravely made a covert trip to visit President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv, Ukraine. And President Biden made the trip by train from Poland. In going to Kyiv, Biden was entering a war zone and putting his safety in the hands of Ukrainian armed forces and also those of the Russians. Moscow was given a heads up a few hours before he crossed the border. The calculation was that Vladimir Putin would not risk the precedent of a presidential assassination or an all-out war for that matter. Never in President Biden's lifetime has a president ventured into a war zone that was not under control of American forces and on a relatively slow-moving locomotive that would take 9.5 hours to reach its destination. The trip is a symbolic one that affirmed President Biden's support for Ukraine. He said that he thought it was critical that there be no doubt whatsoever about US support for Ukraine. And Biden's speech was both for President Zelensky's benefit and also aimed at President Vladimir Putin of Russia. And also the speech was designed to sort of speak to Americans back home who have been doubting his decision to invest so deeply in the war in Ukraine. As he said, it's not just about freedom in Ukraine, it's about freedom of democracy at large. The trip had been in the work for quite a few months, and aides said that only a trusted few officials in the White House, Pentagon, and Secret Service and intelligence agencies were a part of it. The trip was combined with Biden's planned visit to Poland, but the secret stopover was put at the beginning of the trip rather than later, which is more sort of typical for these kind of trips. And on the day of travel, Biden finished his meal with his wife on a Sunday night, and then he slipped out of the White House when many had assumed he'd gone to bed, and he flew out of Andrews Air Force Base at 4:15 a.m. on a smaller C-32 Air Force jet, and after a refueling stop in Germany, his plane landed in Poland at 7:57 p.m, and then Biden joined the train at 9:15 p.m, and then arrived in Kyiv at 8 a.m. the next morning. So, Matt, what were your thoughts on this historic trip?
I really geek out on the nuts and bolts of how these trips happen, like what assets, what aircraft were involved, where did he, physically fly into, what the security situation was like, how it was decided that these trips go down. I think it was kind of apparent that at some point soon that Biden would have made a trip into Ukraine. I mean, Boris Johnson has been there at least once, if not more than that.
I think he's been at least
PM.
2 or 3 times, I think.
Right,
yeah, even
right.
Post being prime minister, and then we've had Rishi Sunak's recently gone over there.
Yeah.
Liz Truss didn't go, I don't think.
She wasn't around long enough. She might have gotten there eventually, but that could send the head of lettuce instead. But no, I mean, it sort of surprised me that he made it all the way to Kyiv. It would have seemed more realistic to me if he, just went right over the border or went to somewhere like Lviv in the west. It's been a lot more safe. But it's interesting to me, if you look at how the planning for a trip like this would go. I mean, so the White House would early on go to the Secret Service and ask for their assessment on the security situation. Like, is this feasible? Can we pull this off? And of course, the Secret Service, their primary job under law is to ensure the President of the United States' survival and his safety. And if you look at it as that kind of a zero-sum mission, the answer that they would give is no. He goes nowhere near Ukraine, if that's your job. But to their credit, if the White House comes back and says, okay, but we're going to go, for these policy reasons and because we decided that we want to do this, the Secret Service is going to go back and they're going to find a way to figure it out, So this article goes into great detail about rather than the usual press pool of 13 reporters that usually travel with the president overseas, they picked 2, one from the Associated Press and the other one escapes me at the moment, but it was just 2. Their phones were confiscated and they were sort of sworn to secrecy for the length of the trip. The White House sort of just flat out lied to the press corps. I mean, it was, I think Biden and the First Lady went to Mass at Georgetown. They had dinner at the Red Hen in D.C., great restaurant if you get a chance to go, and then kind of, disappeared. I think it's curious that they took a C-32, instead of, the big Air Force One. So with C-32 is a converted military conversion of a Boeing 757. So it's a bit smaller. Biden has used that in the past, I think, a lot of times. So when he goes to his home in Wilmington, Delaware, or his beach house in Rehoboth, it's easier to get into smaller airfields that way. So he does use that. But you would see the C-32 is traditionally used for like the vice president, the first lady, secretary of state, other senior cabinet members. But it's not, okay, so if you're thinking, if you have Air Force One, this huge 747, probably the most famous plane in the world, transiting that arc from the eastern seaboard of the U.S. into Western Europe. That's some of the most congested airspace in the world. And it only takes one commercial airline pilot to look out the window and go, hey, that's Air Force One, and, say that over the radio to a control tower somewhere. And the whole trip is sort of blown. So using that C-32 gives them immediately a lot more deniability. Yes, it's a high-ranking U.S. official, but you don't know which one, And like,
yeah, you would assume it's a foreign secretary or something.
Right. Yeah. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, going into Western Europe or into Poland or something is not a big deal. That's happened before. So he flew into Ramstein Air Base in Germany, refueled, and then made another trip into an airbase in eastern Poland, I believe, and then took this 10-hour train trip across Western Ukraine into Kyiv. You have the president of the United States entering a country where the airspace is still contested. There are Russian warplanes and missiles flying around overhead all the time, and we have no control over it. You think of some of these surprise trips that Obama and Bush made into Iraq and Afghanistan in previous years. We controlled the country. Yeah, there was an insurgency going on. It was dangerous, but we controlled the airspace. We had military control over the country. That was not the case here. It's incredibly ballsy. I think it speaks volumes that you were a year out from the beginning of this invasion, and Joe Biden was walking the streets of central Kyiv and not Vladimir Putin. That says a lot. I'm sure there was also, it's not reported in here, but I'm sure on the back end there was a large quick reaction force of constituted by the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, that probably staged right over their border in Poland, that could have easily swept in and assisted. That said, I said on Twitter at the time, on the day that this happened, that there is probably no one who wanted Biden to leave Ukraine unharmed more than the Russian high command.
Yeah, because if they'd accidentally killed President Biden, that would have been World War III kicking off.
Yeah, no, basically. They don't want that. They're ruthless murderers, but they're not, completely insane like that, and I believe there was some reporting that just as he was about to enter the country, there was a message sent across the hotline between Washington and Moscow that, hey, we're doing this, back off. And I think that just goes to show you that deconfliction works, that hotlines work when both sides want them to.
Yeah, indeed. Funny, actually, you mentioned a hotline. I believe it's actually like a fax machine.
Yeah, it's a teletype machine. The U.S. end of it is at the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon. I'm not sure where the Russian end of it is, but
and obviously a fictional equivalent of it features in that Ben Affleck, Jack Ryan film, The Sum of All Fears.
Sum of All Fears.
Typing away.
Yeah.
Which is, I've rewatched that a couple of times since this war's kicked off. I don't know why. It feels like the appropriate Tom Clancy film to be watching.
Yeah, that's fair.
Oh dear. Yeah. Well, like you, I found this truly fascinating. I was thrilled to see President Biden make this historic trip, and I'm sure the U.S. Secret Service would not thrilled by the prospects. And I'd be interested to see in time what comes out from that, because I know there's been a bit of reported contested relationship between Biden and the Secret Service, and whether this trip may or may not reflect that. I don't know. I'm just speculating out loud at this point, but be interested to see, because I imagine the Secret Service probably said no to this, because I can't believe
they definitely said no. They were told to do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd be interested to see if any more details in time come out about that, whether somebody publishes a memoir in a few years or whatever, but something will come out. And I'm sure there's a new Gerard Butler film with Fallen in the title being written about a disastrous version of this trip.
Yeah, Kyiv has fallen.
So probably in 2 years' time, Kyiv has fallen or something. I don't know what it would be called, but yeah. Oh, dear. Yeah, and my other thoughts were, so with this speech, obviously Biden's speech was partly aimed at America, and I think I'm right in saying, being a Brit looking at America, that obviously the US political debates about whether America should or should not be supporting Ukraine is somewhat contested. Certainly with the presidential elections coming up next year, I don't think there's any guarantee beyond the next election that there will be US support, because if former President Trump gets re-elected, he's made it quite clear that he is against supporting Ukraine on a military scale, and has even gone as far recently as to say that he believes Putin and the Russian government over US intelligence, who he's called lowlifes.
Yeah.
And then Trump also believes that he could end this war in a day. So I think, there's certainly, I think this year in particular is a very crucial year for this war in Ukraine. I think Putin knows that too, and I have a feeling that Putin's strategy is to drag this out as long as possible, to see if the presidential elections go in his favour next year, whether that be via Trump or some other candidate. I don't know. I don't know what your views on that, what your view is, I suppose, from your side of the pond, so to speak.
Right. It is becoming, the issue of support to Ukraine is becoming quickly much more of a politicized issue, that, how you feel on it depends on whether you identify as Democrat or Republican. I think that's unfortunate. It's been treated as kind of a false equivalency between, okay, we either support the Ukrainians or we crack down on border security or something like that, or we clean up the town in Ohio that had the Norfolk Southern train derailment, which it's not, we're capable of doing both quite well, I think. I think the deal that we get, that we are able every single day to whittle down the Russian armed forces, to beat them into the ground for basically as a fraction of our defense budget. It's an incredibly good deal. The best way, a lot of these people on, and I know I'm quite center left. I know you are too. I make no secrets about that. A lot of these people in the US on the right who oppose continued support for Ukraine are also some of the most staunchest China hawks that we have, and I think the best way right now for us to deter China from invading Taiwan at some point in the near future is to make sure that Russia gets their asses kicked in Ukraine, to make that brutally apparent to everyone. Like you see on Russian state media, they complain all the time, like, oh, we're fighting all of NATO on our own. No, you're not. You're fighting our excess stockpiles, and you're getting the floor mopped with you. It's a very good deal, I think. And I think that's what's so important about this trip, that Biden went to Kyiv and to Poland and made that case. To, you said it was directed towards the American people to show that this cause matches our national values, the right to freedom, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the right for people to have self-determination, who they want to be. Yeah, it's right as we go into 2024 to make this case quite publicly to the American people, and I'm glad that he did it.
Yeah, I think it's good that he did it. It's interesting because, like, in UK politics, I think support for Ukraine is a very mainstream It's got a mainstream kind of universal appeal across both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, but it's the fringes of those parties who are anti the war. So you've got the far right kind of fringe of the Conservative Party, who are quite pro-Russian, and then obviously you've got the far left side of Labour, which thankfully is not as dominant as it was, but at one time it was being ruled by Jeremy Corbyn Labour, and had Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister, he was calling for the end of, for pulling out of NATO and all sorts of things that echoed, ironically, Trump. So it's good that Corbyn has somewhat been sidelined now, because had we had Corbyn coming up as potential Prime Minister material for the next election here, because at the moment Labour are polling very well in the UK. I think there's a feeling of the UK public are a bit tired of Conservatives, but things could change. Who knows? But if Labour are likely to win, I'm kind of personally glad it's under Keir Starmer and not Jeremy Corbyn, because at least with Keir Starmer there will be continued support for Ukraine. But then saying that, obviously, depending on who wins the American election, that will determine a lot of things. There's an expression about if America sneezes, the world gets a cold, or something like that. So I think if I don't know whether it would be Trump or whoever, but somebody else does win the next election and they are anti-support for Ukraine, it will cause a problem for Europe and I think for NATO. Because if America does pull out of supporting Ukraine, then I think that's going to be almost sort of game over in many respects. It'll be very hard for Britain and in Europe to sort of financially hold that, kind of be able to support the efforts on their own without America's support. So I think Ukraine, I feel they need to win this war this year for this not to become an issue for them, because I have a feeling next year it's going to become problematic.
I agree with that as well. I think the longer this drags on, the longer this war drags on, the more of a risk you have that fractures in that Western alliance will appear, whether it's, so the House just recently went to Republican control. The Senate could at some point go to Republican control in the future, and if you have a united Republican Congress, even if Biden wins re-election, that would make reauthorizing some of these spending bills quite tricky. In the same regard, if in Europe take a turn, if the far right comes to power in France, or if Olaf Scholz's coalition in Germany falls at some point in the future, that throws a wrench in all of this. So while I support what we're doing with Ukraine, and I think it's an excellent deal, I do think it's important that we state what our goals are, what we would like to see, and sort of start setting a timeline. I mean, I don't want to tell the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians are willing to fight, I want to support them. I don't want to tell them to start negotiations that they're not ready to begin if they feel that they're not in the right, in the strongest possible position to do so. I felt in the past that when negotiations begin, whatever territories the Russians currently hold at that moment, it's going to be extremely hard to get that back.
Yeah.
You're negotiating with some of the worst people on earth. And the more territory that the Ukrainians control when those negotiations begin, the stronger position that they're in. That said, I think we need to start looking at how this ends and helping the Ukrainians achieve that, because this can't drag on for another 3+ years or whatever.
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially, your case in point to what you're just saying, Crimea, Russian-controlled territory. Is it possible Ukraine will ever get it back without force? I don't think they will get it back without force. I don't think Putin's going to roll over and say, hey, yeah, you can have it back. It's of too much strategic importance to them. I think Ukraine need to hold on to as much territory as possible, because the more they lose, the more that ends up on the negotiating table. And it is, the other thing as well, it's interesting, I was looking at, we all draw parallels to World War II, for good or bad, but I've been doing a lot of research over the years on Britain and America and World War II in the early years before America kind of officially entered the war. And it was very important that Britain got some serious victories early on to get American support, because it would make it very hard for America to politically back Britain. And at that time, you had the American ambassador, was it Joseph Kennedy, was quite anti-Britain. And so he was sending out a lot of sort of telegrams sort of saying, oh, Britain's done for, it's finished. And thankfully, President Roosevelt completely ignored that and covertly supported Britain as much as he could. But, you know, Britain needed to bring on victories, as does Ukraine, and Ukraine thankfully is delivering victories, and now it's getting the support it needs. Because if you think about a year ago when this started, I mean, I'm on this list in the sense of I honestly thought Ukraine would probably crumble within a few days, because I was just thinking about Afghanistan the year before and how President Ashraf Ghani just fled. And when President Zelensky just said something along the lines of, I don't need a ride, I need bullets, you know, it was like, okay, this is a very different situation here. And hats off to him. He has been, I think, the most inspirational politician of my lifetime. You know, and people like him as Winston Churchill and things like that. And I just think the Ukrainians have done a fantastic job and completely have changed everything, and also poked a massive hole in our views on Russia. We kind of seen Russia as this great power and the second world's most efficient army or whatever, you know, and in fact, Russia is just a corrupt paper tiger. But obviously it has nuclear weapons, so, you know, so one shouldn't totally dismiss the threat from Russia. But a lot of their forces have been decimated, and now they're kind of and they're just using kind of brute force and manpower to keep this war going on. They're using conscripts. And some of these conscripts now only have shovels. They don't even have weapons, guns anymore, because they're running out of ammunition, or they want to. And also, I've been reading that they're sending waves of people to get machine gunned down. So then it wears out the Ukrainians, and then the Russians send in their kind of more elite and better trained troops. But it's a bloodbath, and it's terrible.
It's like the prison conscripts that Wagner's recruited. I've read recently that they've almost sort of exhausted those supplies. I mean, these are the men, to your point, that they just sort of send as cannon fodder across to sort of flush out where the Ukrainian positions are. I think in Bakhmut, the Russians have lost 20 to 30,000 men in trying to take what is essentially a random Ukrainian village. You know, that's insane. If the U.S. military took 20 to 30,000 casualties taking one small town, any administration in the White House would collapse after that point. I think that's the same true with the UK. That government would fall overnight.
Yeah. Well, this is it. I mean, we're at the 20th anniversary of Iraq, aren't we? I mean, had that, and that obviously was not a successful campaign. No. But had that been on the equivalent of what's been going on with Ukraine, I think that would have ended probably a lot faster. You know, it's unreal, really, isn't it? But I think, at least from America's point of view, I think Iraq went a bit better than Ukraine's gone for Russia. But you know, but I suppose that's a whole other topic, really, isn't it?
Well, I think if there's a benefit that these autocracies, and I think in the last 5-10 years especially, it's the world has sort of been divided, and we've talked about this in the past, that the world has sort of been divided in a battle between classical small d democratic liberal democracies and autocracies, whether that's Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China, the far right movements in the US and in Europe. They all sort of fall along those same lines. And if there's any benefit that those autocratic governments have over us, it's that they don't have to think in 2 and 4 year increments. You know, they don't have to worry about midterm elections and getting budgets passed through Congress or Parliament. You know, they have the ability, because they're so entrenched in power, they have the ability to wait and think and plan much longer than we do, and they can wait us out much longer, which is why I think it's important that we start looking at what that end game is and helping the Ukrainians to get there.
No, indeed. I mean, it feels like the Munich Security Conference, where it did come across that different leaders had different expectations of what the outcome of the war should be. So yeah, they definitely need to figure that out. I don't think I don't know. I mean, I think some people would like to see regime change in Russia. I think I'm probably with them a little bit on that, but at the same time, I don't think you can't do it by force, and I don't think the war in Ukraine's the way to do it. But Yeah, but it would be nice to see Putin go in some way or another. But I was just thinking this makes a very nice segue into our Belarus topic, because the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, has been in power since 1994 and never relinquished it. And in fact, he currently owes his presidency to Putin after he sent propagandists and financial support and tanks to help prop him up, and after the 2020 elections didn't quite go in his favor. But so with Belarus, we've had this really interesting article, again from one of our favorites, Michael Weiss, and Holger Roonemaa, and this is for Yahoo News, and they've and the article's titled "Revealed Leaked Documents Show How Russia Plans to Take Over Belarus." And so some of the key points from that article, and I'll come back to you, Matt, is that obviously this is a leaked internal strategy document from Vladimir Putin's executive office, and it was obtained by Yahoo News, and it shows Russia's plans to take full control of neighbouring Belarus in the next decade under the pretext of a merger between the two countries. And in practice, this would eliminate whatever remains of Belarus's sovereignty and put Belarusians at the mercy of Kremlin priorities, whether that be in agriculture, industry, espionage, or war. And it also would pose a security threat to Belarus's European and NATO neighbours, with examples being Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The authorship of this document belongs to a presidential directorate for the cross-border of cooperation, which is a subdivision of President Putin's presidential administration. This Directorate for Cross-Border Cooperation was established 5 years ago, and the actual task of this organization is to exert control over neighboring countries that Russia sees in its sphere of influence. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And according to Western intelligence officials who've been interviewed for this article, the FSB, SVR, and GOU, as well as other military intelligence organizations, have also been a part of putting this document together. One interesting thing there's many interesting things, but one thing that really stood out for me in this was a Western military officer was interviewed but not authorized to speak on the record, and he talks about something called passportization, which is one of the key processes Russia used to quietly take over sovereign territory. And so what they do is they kind of hand out Russian passports to local people in order to extend their interest in that region. So in time, Russians can turn around and say, well, our Russian people need us. So that's kind of what they were doing in Ukraine. So this sort of Belarus document, it basically confirms everything that we've been saying about Russia and Ukraine. And Belarus is kind of considered an ally of Russia at this time, but it just shows Russia wants to take over its allies. Putin wants to rebuild the USSR effectively, and this document is sort of evidence of that ambition being put into practice. So I don't know, Matt, did you have any thoughts on this document?
Yeah, this was quite an interesting read. I mean, I think it sort of confirms the obvious. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Lukashenko's Belarus is already essentially a vassal state of Russia, and has been at least since Lukashenko put down those pro-democracy protests after the last election. That was widely considered to be essentially rigged. I think it does really just go to show what Putin has in mind for that post-Soviet space. I'm curious as to why they put 2030 as sort of their target date to achieve this. I mean, why wait 7 years when it seems like this is something that could be done relatively much sooner?
Well, I guess it's that long-term game, isn't it? I mean, I believe, if I remember correctly, like with Soviet communist doctrine, they believed it'd take about 100 years to fully take over a country and completely change it, because you need the previous generations knew how it was to sort of die out.
Right.
So then the new generations who don't know any better, will think that this is normal. I mean, you could see that in North Korea as a good example, and probably even you could argue China.
Right.
So maybe it harkens back to that.
If you look at sort of the makeup in Belarus, especially in those last elections, I mean, it was the older generations who have fonder memories of life under the Soviet Union that were more sympathetic to the Russians and to Lukashenko. And it was the younger generations who were out in the street protesting. But I mean, it's curious that they, have this plan to sort of pass out Russian passports in Russian speaking areas of the country. I mean, that's what the Russians did in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, these two breakaway provinces in Georgia that the Russians have occupied since 2008, essentially, right? They did this initially when those, little green men showed up in Crimea in 2014.
Yeah.
It's sort of the classic Russian plan there. When you sent this article to me as we were sort of discussing the outline of the show today, it jogged my memory of a piece that came out last year, right after the invasion, if you sort of want to go into that a bit, because I think it shows nicely the Russian worldview and sort of what they had in mind in this alternate universe. So this is an article, it's from late February of 2022. So this is February 28th, so 2 days after the invasion began in Ukraine. It's by Yelena Dzhanova, called Russian State News Accidentally Publishes Article Saying Russia Has Defeated Ukraine and Restored its historical borders. And this article describes an article that was accidentally published on the website of RIA Novosti, which is a Russian state media outlet. It was, it's sort of like that joke that people like time tweets to send out automatically, and then something happens that makes that tweet entirely like inappropriate or irrelevant or something, and it goes out anyway.
Yeah.
That's basically what happened here. But it's kind of chilling. I mean, it was supposed to run on February 26th. So that's 2 days after the invasion started. So that gives you some sense of the Russian mindset and just how overly ridiculously confident they were in their own goals and ambitions in Ukraine, that within 2 days, this article talks about how the Russians have captured Kyiv. The article praises the return of Ukraine to its natural state as part of Russia. Here's a quote from it. The period of the split of the Russian people is coming to an end. Did someone in the old European capitals in Paris and Berlin seriously believe that Moscow would give up Kyiv, that the Russians would forever be a divided people? And it praises this new era of the Russian world with Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine united as a whole. So I think it just shows the sheer arrogance of the Russians in how quickly they thought this adventure into Ukraine would have gone. That they saw Ukrainians as essentially not even a real kind of nation state, that the Russians would have just marched in and the resistance would have just collapsed and they would have been greeted as liberators. I mean, there's lots of reports that some of their initial task force that was designated to capture Kyiv, they packed dress uniforms with them. And they intended on having like a parade through Kyiv, a victory parade, days afterwards. And so, I mean, there's an alternate universe out there where
Man in the High Castle, isn't it?
yeah, really. It's that kind of stuff. And I think, to what we were saying earlier, that if a different government was in place in Washington or in certain parts of Europe, I mean, if Putin had decided to invade a year or two earlier, this is the scenario that we could have gotten,
I am still fascinated by why Putin didn't try this under Trump, because I would have thought from Putin's point of view, Trump would have been more sympathetic to him. I honestly don't know why that didn't happen. So I wish I did. I could speculate whether this was just some, because I know some speculate that Putin kind of lost his, what's the word I want now? But
his marbles.
Yeah, his marbles. Whether it's some weird COVID fever dream that turned into a horrible reality and then a nightmare.
Maybe.
And that might, I don't know. It's really strange, isn't it? It's so strange he left it so long.
There's been a lot of reporting of how tight, in such tight isolation that he was in during COVID. I mean, that he saw basically no one and was reading all these sort of strange Russian ultranationalist philosophers, sort of Russian Orthodox preachers that sort of just imbued his mind with this kind of sense that Ukraine wasn't real and that they would fold so easily. And I think this also shows you how wrong the Russian intelligence services were in their assessment of what kind of resistance the Ukrainians would set up, which goes to show that, when you surround yourself with a bunch of yes men and lackeys or people who are afraid to tell you the truth, you start to believe your own propaganda, and this is what you get.
So true. Well, this is it. Yeah, this is the danger of intelligence services who are just trying to paint a picture of what you want. I mean, I remember with Oleg Gordievsky's biography, you could have a drink there. I'm sure there's a drinking game for this podcast. I always mention Oleg at least once every few episodes. But it's like, I remember there's a bit in that biography where he was taught as a young KGB officer how to write a report in a particular way that would be sort of that would put a situation and spin a light on a thing in a certain way that would be favorable back at the Kremlin rather than being authentically true about something.
Yeah.
And on top of that, like I've had those conversations with Dr. Kuzio about the corruption within the Russian system. So it does seem like Russian intelligence, which again, we kind of maybe painted in a similar light to the Russian army of being this sort of amazing force to be reckoned with. And obviously the Russian intelligence service has gone around murdering people for quite some time now under Putin. So they kind of, when people go around murdering people, it does sort of give them a certain... I don't know, a certain vibe. So you kind of, because you don't, a lot of people like to believe that the CIA go around murdering people all the time, like, and I'm amazed how many people I speak to who really genuinely believe that the Jason Bourne Treadstone thing is based on reality. And
it's kill people sometimes, but there's a lot of red tape involved.
Of course. Well, this is it. And also, generally, it's in a theatre of war. The CIA don't generally, certainly since post the Church Committee, have not gone round sort of knocking on strangers' doors in the middle of Europe and bumping them off.
No.
Or lacing their front door with Novichok. I don't think the Americans have really ever done that.
No.
So we've kind of given the Russian intelligence service has been kind of given a bit of street cred that maybe they don't deserve. Maybe they are just deeply corrupt and more incompetent than we have been led to believe. I mean, to be fair, quite a lot of the murders they've been involved with we know about, which isn't isn't particularly great tradecraft. So it's a funny one, isn't it? So they probably have been painting a very weird picture for Putin for many years, and he has deluded himself.
Yep.
Yeah. So the other thing that comes up quite often with talk about the war is NATO expansionism. It's sort of a favoured topic of sort of what we call tankies on the left and then, sort of people on the far right who are pro-Russia. Yep. And I think, to be fair, what all of this has shown is why you need NATO and why those former Eastern Bloc countries joined NATO, because they knew if they join NATO, it make it much more unlikely that Russia would try what they're doing in Ukraine. And there's been much debate for many years about whether, Ukraine should have been in NATO and whether Ukraine should have given up on its nuclear weapons. And I really think that it's very clear that Ukraine should have been allowed to join NATO a long time ago. And if they had, none of this would have happened, in my opinion. So it's an interesting one. And the last sort of talking point that drives me up the wall with Russian propaganda is how they like to paint the Ukrainians who want to be a part of Europe and want to be a part of NATO as Nazis. And, it's been... I remember back in the Euromaidan process, was it 2013, having debates with people online about the Ukrainians who wanted to join the EU. Britain was trying to leave the EU, and the Ukrainians were dying, wanting to join the EU. And I remember being quite moved by that whole thing. And having endless debates with people on the left who were buying into this Russian propaganda that somehow these young people who wanted a better future were somehow Nazis. And, I was outraged by it then. I'm still outraged by it now. And quite frankly, I think what the Russians have shown with their dreadful brute force policies is they are the Nazis in this situation.
Oh, completely.
And frankly, yeah. And if anybody's any doubt of that, then they're fucking delusional. I'll put it that way. Roger Waters, you're completely fucking delusional.
Yeah, absolutely.
Honestly,
that's a good. Yeah. I mean, you think about like, okay, yeah, they say like we're fighting Nazism. in Ukraine, and one of the leaders of the Wagner group has literal SS insignias tattooed on him.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Which it's also
and
it's
white
such
supremacists love him too.
Yeah, it's such a crazy thing to think how this is sort of turned around, how Putinism has so warped the Russian consciousness back around. When you think how since the 40s, how that memory of the Great Patriotic War, of that resistance and that victory at Stalingrad, and that fight against the Nazis was sort of the biggest rallying, unifying ideology of the Soviet people for so long, and now it's sort of twisted around. And no, they don't call themselves National Socialists, but that ideology, that temperament is the same thing. This is an overused term, but it's gaslighting, the rest of the world.
Yeah.
It drives you crazy to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, this is it. I've always been of the firm belief that fascism and communism are pretty much the same thing, but communism has better social healthcare. So it's always been my view on it. And so it's not exactly a massive step from going from communism to fascism, basically, as far as I'm concerned with Russia. One last thing that's sort of been on my mind with this dreadful war is, I don't know if you saw it this week, that poor Ukrainian soldier who was having this last cigarette and said, "Glory to Ukraine," and then he was executed by machine gun fire. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see that, no.
It's this terrible video that's been kind of going around, and the Ukrainians have finally named their soldier. Alexander Matsevsky is the name of the soldier. It's a Ukrainian soldier who basically was gunned down in cold blood by Russians who had captured him. And then were, obviously giving him a last cigarette, and then asked him for his last words, and he said, "Glory to Ukraine," and then they just machine gun him down. And this video has really stuck with me this week, and it's just like, these are the Nazis. The fricking Russians are the Nazis in this situation. And I'm just appalled and shocked by how many people on the far left and the far right who just don't see it, and it's it's very frustrating.
To your point about the comparisons between the Russians today and Nazis, what you're describing is the exact same tactics that were used by the Einsatzgruppen, when they went in behind German, after the initial German advance, they would go in behind into these occupied territories, into Belarus, into Ukraine, into Russia, and would just systematically just machine gun whole villages. I mean, it's the exact same tactics.
I remember I've had many a childhood holiday to Normandy in France, and my dad was a bit of a World War II buff, and we went to many a village where you could go to the local church and still see the bullet holes from where they lined up the men of that village and machine gunned them to death. It's always stuck with me, that quite a morbid thing as a child to sort of come across in your holidays, but it's sort of definitely left a valuable lesson there. And it's appalling. I mean, we are seeing the evidence of the war crimes coming out from those Russian occupied villages and stuff, the mass raping, the torture, the murder, the mass graves. It's appalling. And it's just depressing that there are intelligent people who just seem to be confused by this situation. I find that truly, truly mind-blowing, but there we go.
Yeah.
So, JALEL HARCHAOUI for War on the Rocks wrote a really interesting piece called Libya's Fragile Deadlock. So, back in January, CIA Director William Burns made a whirlwind visit to Benghazi and Tripoli on January the 12th, and he was asking contending Libyan leaders to expel roughly 1,000 Russian personnel and help organize nationwide elections. But despite being the most senior US official to set foot in Libya in years, Burns is unlikely to get what he wishes. And what this piece outlines, and I won't go into great detail on this, but the situation in Libya at the moment is quite divided. You might have a president of Libya, but he doesn't have control of the entire country. And you've got the president of Libya is sort of backed by the Turkish. Then you've got Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, who runs the Libyan National Army, and he has control of oil-rich east and south. And he is backed by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, France, and Greece. And then you have an Egyptian-backed opponent of the president, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Akil Salah. And so basically the prospect of an actual election in Libya doesn't look very likely at the moment, because each of the factions in Libya kind of have backing from foreign powers, and on top of that they seem to have found a way to kind of get funds to support themselves and bypass the national government based in Tripoli. And so the thing with Libya, there's a few areas of concern. Obviously, number one, there's a lot of natural resources that all those countries have mentioned, America, Saudi Arabia, France, and so on, who are interested, and Turkey are interested in those natural resources. But also there's a very complex counterterrorism situation that needs to be looked at, because you've got Al-Qaeda and ISIS, particularly ISIS, very popular in Libya. And if left unchecked, that could become a massive problem. And in fact, North Africa and even West Africa are becoming the kind of hot points for jihadist terrorism today, almost more than the Middle East. And so I'm sure the CIA Director Burns is quite conscious of that, and is doing his best to try and sort of build sort of assets and relationships with all the kind of key figureheads of that country to keep those counterterrorism conversations going, as well as also the conversations probably related to natural resources. So, so it's a very interesting article, and I think the main point of the article is sort of saying is that it's going to be very difficult to change the situation in Libya currently, and a national election does not guarantee any kind of peaceful sort of outcome. It could actually, in fact, lead to another civil war in the country, which could make the situation worse. So it's a very difficult situation for the US, UN, and other countries to really want to try and wade into. I don't know, Matt, are there any thoughts you had on this piece?
To me, I think this shows what kind of a disappointment Libya has been in the last 10 years or so. I mean, I remember watching on TV when Gaddafi was frankly lynched,
I remember
by
that.
his own people, and overthrown. I mean, quite a gruesome show there, but I think there was a lot of hope for the country right afterwards. I mean, we're over 10 years removed from that now, and I think unfortunately for a lot of Americans, history in Libya ended with the Benghazi attacks. I mean, that was sort of the punctuation mark on our involvement there, but that's not true. I mean, this is gone on, continued since, and you see, it's, I don't want to say it's colonialism, but it's reminiscent of colonium. It's reminiscent of colonialism, where you have these much greater powers all sort of backing their own different sides, or they're fighting each other. So you have the Egyptians supporting some people, the Saudis, the Emiratis, Turkey with their own forces in there. I mean, Bill Burns, the CIA director, asked the Libyans to expel 1,000 Russian Wagner personnel, so they're there too. It's an absolute mess. I think Africa as a whole is quite a blind spot for the U.S. right now, and has been for a lot. I mean, we see a lot of Russian influence, not just in Libya, but in Mali, in the Central African Republic, in South Africa. I mean, South Africa has been quite flirty with the Russians and the Chinese recently. The Chinese are doing a lot of development projects, even in Nigeria and all across the continent with their Belt and Road initiative. That's arguably a bit of a debt trap that they're setting for these countries. I mean, you could do a whole show on that on its own. But I think it just goes to show that while we've been so focused on East Asia, on the South China Sea, on Ukraine, and confronting the Russians in Europe, there's this whole other continent down there that it's a lot going on there that has not gotten much attention in recent years. And unfortunately, I don't see this situation in Libya getting resolved anytime soon. It's unfortunate, because there was a lot of hope for Libya right after Gaddafi fell.
There was. I remember that time very much, because obviously the Gaddafi regime were murdering their own citizens and trying to
Yeah.
really clamp down, because I think they were worried. Was that because that was during the Arab Spring, wasn't it? So I think Gaddafi was just suddenly freaked
part of
out
it.
that. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
very much freaked out by it, and went full on scorched earth and started killing all sorts of people, and there was like protesters being machine gunned down and stuff like that. So I think it was a very justifiable case for wanting to get rid of him. And I even remember the then Prime Minister David Cameron flew out to Libya just after Gaddafi had gone, and at that time, the British were cheered as heroes for helping, using their air force to help sort of get rid of Gaddafi. And how times have changed. I mean, God, one of the worst bombings in British history, the Manchester bombing of 2017, was committed by a Libyan national named Salman Abadi, and and he killed 22 people and injured 1,000 people at a stadium, and was targeting teenagers going to a concert, and there's been in the UK, we've just had a massive tribunal about that, looking into the MI5 missed opportunities to stop that. So yeah, the terrorism threat from Libya is very real and should never be ignored. And the problem is, like, terrorist groups love failed states, and if Libya does become a failed state, at the moment it looks to me more like it might end up just becoming kind of lots of just factions, and maybe it creates a stability that way. Maybe Libya as a country maybe need to rethink it and just turn it into, and it's just becomes sort of zones under various leaders. I don't know, but it certainly, if another election does happen, there's no guarantee of any stability. So yeah, maybe it is best left in its sort of current situation, because it sort of is functioning, but it's but yeah, but one's going to be really careful with that. But as we were saying earlier, North and West Africa is becoming the hotspot for jihadism at the moment, and and obviously with that, plus then Afghanistan, those are kind of key areas where the next big plot could come from, which is the big fear, isn't it? Because that's, even though we've been very lucky in the last maybe 3 or 4 years on regards to jihadist-inspired terrorism, that threat's never gone away. Certainly UK threat assessments still put it above far-right terrorism. I don't know about the US. I don't know what the situation. I think far-right terrorism is slowly taken over jihadist terrorism. It is the number one threat at the moment. Yeah. But in the UK, it's the other way around. So it's something to kind of keep an eye on, really. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or should we just swing by Australia quickly?
We can make a quick stop in Australia.
Yeah, cool. Well, we're going to just very briefly go down under. And there's a really great article in The Guardian called Hive of Spies. It's all about basically the Australian intelligence chief has talked about a major spy network that's been removed from the country. Mike Burgess, who's the head of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, boasted a removal of what he called a hive of spies, as he's declared his agency was taking a more aggressive counter-espionage posture. He did not name the Foreign Intelligence Service that they ousted from the country. I would put my money on China. I could be wrong there, but that's where I put my money. So he decided not to name the country. But apparently the unnamed Foreign Intelligence Services had plotted to lure a critic of that country's regime to travel outside of Australia so they could be disposed of. That could also hint at maybe even Saudi Arabia, but because of the they have a tendency to bump off their critics in their own embassies, but I still think it might be China there. And then there's also been examples of possible attempts to physically harm members of their diaspora community. So again, I think that's looking like China. We've had a scandal recently in the UK involving nationals from Hong Kong who've come to the UK who are suddenly being harassed by the Chinese Communist Party in the UK. So yeah, we've sort of touched upon stuff like that in previous episodes. And then Burgess said that whilst terrorism is an ongoing threat, Australia was facing an unprecedented challenge from espionage and foreign interference. And he said it feels like hand-to-hand combat. So that's a pretty bold statement there. And I know for many years, Western intelligence has been very counterterrorism focused, and some have argued at the cost of counterintelligence. So, Australia is definitely taking a different stance on that now. So, Matt, I don't know if there's any thoughts you had on that one.
I think you kind of said it nicely. I mean, Burgess does not name the specific foreign intelligence services, but reading between the tea leaves, I mean, there's some activity that he describes that reads sort of like an illegals network, operating under non-official cover. That I'm not an expert in Chinese intelligence operations, but I haven't heard much about them doing that kind of stuff. I mean, I hear that, I think more of the Russians. I don't know that this was the Russians, but that when I hear like these illegals networks, my mind immediately goes to the Russians. And the other thing here that he says, to your point, the sort of harassment and monitoring of critics in diaspora communities and trying to sort of lure them out of Australia to a third country where they could be, I guess, renditioned back to their home state, that screams of China. I mean, that's reminiscent of also, like we've talked about in previous episodes, those quote unquote Chinese police stations in New York and London and elsewhere. I mean, that's exactly what they're meant to do.
No, indeed. So yeah, and it's interesting timing as well, because you've got the whole ARCA submarine program that's very much part of US and NATO strategy to have more nuclear capable submarines in the Pacific theater against potential threats from China.
Yeah, that AUKUS deal is absolutely meant to counter the Chinese.
Yeah, indeed. So I suspect China wants to be all over that and any other defense posture relating to China. I think, if anything, I mean, Australia is actually a very key component of potential future NATO strategy against China.
Sure.
So I think it doesn't surprise me that they're, potentially China's all over Australia at the moment. So, so no doubt that best to keep an eye on that. I'm sure there'll be more stories coming soon. So we've mentioned in previous episodes there's been this sort of interesting thing about neo-Nazis and blackouts and and as we said earlier as well, that one of the number one threats in America is sort of domestic terrorism with a kind of neo-Nazi slant. And Matt, you pointed me to an article about a neo-Nazi movement behind a plot to black out Baltimore. What can you tell us about that?
So this is an article. It's a local news outfit in Baltimore, Maryland, and this will be linked in the show notes. It's by Brenna Smith, and it's called "The Neo-Nazi Movement Behind the Plot to Black Out Baltimore," and it describes a two neo-Nazis charged with federal crimes plotting to attack Baltimore's energy grid. It's part of a decades-old doctrine to push the country into armed racial conflict. This is sort of an accelerationist goal to thinking that if they, cut off the power grid, they can kickstart a race war in the United States. I for one don't see how causing a blackout in Baltimore or elsewhere. I mean, you've seen these issues bubble up in like North Carolina and Idaho also recently. I don't see how causing a blackout would trigger a race war, but I'm not a neo-Nazi white supremacist, so maybe I don't get what they're seeing here. It's I mean, very much reminiscent of these sort of fantastical plots you would see in like the Turner Diaries. That classic novel that inspired so many white supremacist plots, even going back to the Oklahoma City bombing with Timothy McVeigh. It just shows that these groups are just still out there. And there's another sort of quick article that caught my mind. Is in Bellingcat, Borderless Vigilantism, the nativist U.S. militias entering Mexico. And this is from Avery Schmitz, who is a senior at George Washington University. That's pretty impressive that he's in Bellingcat, but goes into detail on this group of, I guess I'll say, a far-right group called Veterans on Patrol that are based in Pima County, Arizona, and sort of array themselves along the border and are meant to, on their own, apprehend people crossing the border and have even chased them back across the border into Mexico. And I know there's a sizable separating this from the neo-Nazis for a second here, trying to cause a race war. With this border thing, there's definitely a sizable portion of people in the United States, and maybe even some people listening to this, who don't really see an issue with this. And I don't want to get into the whole, border issue and immigration and stuff. I think it's unfortunate that it's been so politicized by people who would rather have this issue to campaign on rather than actually solve it. But I mean, regardless of how you feel about that, I see this as being quite dangerous to cross the border into Mexico. Armed groups crossing the border into Mexico. I think it's quite dangerous, and I think it's important to sort of flag the security situation in Mexico in general. I mean, even this week, a group of Americans traveled into Matamoros, Mexico.
Oh, yes.
From South Carolina. Yeah. One of them in the group was trying to get sort of like a dodgy black market plastic surgery. So they traveled into Matamoros, Mexico, right over the border from Brownsville, Texas. And they were kidnapped by the Jalisco New Generation cartel. This is the second most powerful cartel in Mexico. Mexican authorities recovered 2 of the 4, and 2 were killed by the cartel. But I just want to flag this because I see the Jalisco cartel, especially, they're essentially a paramilitary organization, much more so than what we would consider to be, the classic sort of cartel model of like Pablo Escobar in Colombia in the 80s. I mean, they're arguably a terrorist organization. And I've sort of thought before that a lot of that extreme drug war related violence that you see in Mexico, if that in the future bleeds up north of the border into the United States, whether it's, I don't know, you have a skirmish that's triggered by this vigilante militia crossing into Mexico and they get into a scrap with the cartel, or if that violence of the drug war in Mexico is brought home into the United States, given the political situation here in this country with border security and drugs and this kind of nativism and how politicized that is, I see that could quickly become a huge issue in this country and would, frankly, I think, necessitate a military response from the Biden administration if it got that bad, if that started to happen here. And I think that's just an important thing to sort of flag potentially for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the statistics, but I read somewhere that the amount of violence in Mexico is far worse than I think Iraq and Afghanistan put together.
Yeah.
It's definitely an issue. And as you say, it's become very politicized. And I think what you've got is a government that's not really fully in control of the situation in Mexico, and that's the problem. I've traveled along the border near Arizona, and I remember getting stopped multiple times by Border Patrol. We somehow took the wrong road, ended up on the road where we were always getting stopped and getting our papers checked by the US ICE or whatever. It's quite tense along there. And obviously that's one of the things that disappointed me about the film Sicario. It kind of copped out a little bit. It kind of did the classic, it's somehow the American government are responsible for all this, and it's somehow some secret American government plan or something. With this plot of Sicario, and I felt like it kind of missed the interesting side of the whole. I mean, it's a very complex thing, and that's what the TV series Narcos tried to go into, but the whole kind of financial side of the problems in Mexico and how the drug consumption fuels it. The demand for drugs from American users, in a sense, is fueling the violence in Mexico as the Mexican cartels try to keep up with the supplying the demand. And it's similar-ish, I suppose, problem with some of the street gangs in London who are murdering each other all the time over sort of drug territories and stuff. It's a very complex situation, which unfortunately then for the Mexico situation ties in with immigration and issues around the other, if we put it that way, and then becomes quickly quite racist in a lot of the debates about it. And then it obscures a real problem in a sense. And we've got a similar issue in the UK with migrant boats, and there's no real sensible debate about it. It's just either racist saying that like the Royal Lifeboats organization who save these people should be arrested, which is ridiculous. And then you've got draconian policies from the Conservative government, but there aren't really any solutions to a pretty untenable and dangerous situation, because we've got a lot of people who are coming to the UK illegally, who are putting their lives at risk and putting the risk of lives of other people who might have to save them. And I don't know, I have no idea what the solution to that problem is, but there isn't a sensible debate about it anymore, because it just gets hijacked by racists or people who should know better, who just run away from it because they don't want to get involved in it because they'll feel they'll be tarnished by the debate. So it's a very complicated one. So I don't know. Yeah, with the Mexico thing, I don't know what the answer is, and I have no idea what the answer is with the migrant boat situation in the UK. But it's not good, and it can't be. Something needs to happen, but it can't be left to fester, because it will just get worse and become more serious. And as you're saying, if it leads to needing a US military response, that's not good.
No,
that'd be terrible.
No, it's not.
So,
I mean, I think the issues with the problem with these issues is it gets so politicized, like we said, and people just go off into their own corners, and there's sort of no progress made on it. Like our issue here with immigration and the border. I mean, it should have been solved years ago, and there were attempts to do so, and they failed. And I mean, frankly, I think some of the most vocal voices on the border, on the issue of immigration, would much rather have this issue to campaign on and sort of fire up and scare their base rather than actually solving it, because then there would be nothing to talk about.
Yeah, this is it. And people of extreme politics like, they like something that they can use to rally people up. And, this is a similar thing with the war on terror. A lot of people didn't want to go anywhere near it because of the, Islamist nature of the terrorism. People were scared that by tackling the issues around fundamentalist Islam that leads to people becoming terrorists, they were just scared to go anywhere near that topic. And actually, looking at movies around the war on terror, a lot of movies would rather have a lot of spy movies would rather have the plot that the CIA was somehow the bad guy and go nowhere near Islamic extremism. And it's I don't know why I've kind of got into that tangent, but it's been on my mind a little bit when watching a lot of contemporary spy fiction, at least with movies, how they want to steer clear of the war on terror but somehow still want to be relevant. And so somehow the CIA has to become the bad guy to facilitate that plot. So it's interesting.
Well, I think that issue of Islamism and Islamic fundamentalism at home, like within your society, has always been a much greater issue for you guys in the UK than it was over here. I mean, we have Muslim communities all over the country, but they're integrated. They're not radicalized. That's never been that's never really been the concern here to the extent that it has been for you guys in the last 20 years or so.
No. What is it? I think the problem with the UK immigrant communities have always been treated as they've always been otherized, and they've never been there's never been a proper effort to find a way to make those people feel welcome and feel part of the community. They're always, to quote some right-wing people I've met over the years, they're not really British. Even though they're born here and got a British passport, they're somehow not British, which is ridiculous. Whilst at least with America, and this might be changing, but the perception I've always had of America is, in a sense, no matter where you come from, if you're an American citizen, you're an American, you're a part of something. That's a very big difference. I think that's probably being challenged a bit now, but certainly maybe 20 years ago, that was a very big, compelling force that kind of held American society together. And I see that becoming fractured a little bit. Whether that's because of the Russians or not is another matter, but Russian propaganda working to crack American society and Western society open. Wouldn't be surprised. There's certainly a lot of evidence to say that there is that. But so it's I don't know where we're going with that one, but there's always been a fundamental difference between America and Britain in that regard, and I think Britain has missed a very valuable point. And I think Britain's paying for it, or has paid for it, and is paying for it a little bit. And I think Britain could do better in helping communities feel more welcome here.
Well, I mean, this could be quite a controversial statement, but I think it's quite easy to be accepted into polite society in the UK if you have the money to buy your way in.
Oh yeah,
I mean, take a
Russians.
walk around Kensington
Yeah.
and Chelsea, and
Yeah.
you'll see that very quickly.
Oh yeah, we like rich people.
Yeah.
You know, it's especially, you know, the various political parties like rich people too, you know, of different
We
persuasions.
won't name them.
No. But it's it's a funny thing. In Britain, money does, it's money, and you know, that's the sad thing. Actually, Britain still as a society, if you are born from money or go to the right places, and your sequence of your life goes in a certain direction,
Yeah.
it could totally change everything. It's still very much it feels like a very much a rigged game in certain ways. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine from France who's lived here for half of his life, but he doesn't want to bring his kids up over to the UK because he still feels Britain's too rigged as a society, and I think he's not far wrong. There are certain elements of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you guys have always sort of had that issue with class and the lingering vestiges of aristocracy that is just kind of foreign to us.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this is it. And do you think that's changing in the States or not? I mean, because obviously there's a big divide between wealthy and poor growing in America,
I think
as much as over here.
there is. I mean, I think we're arguably in a second Gilded Age. I don't know that that's just exclusive to the U.S. I think it's true of the Western world in general. I think the world is very quickly being optimized for the 1%. Unfortunately, I think there's you can only push that so far. I mean, I think this is in history where that's gotten so bad and just collapsed. I'm thinking of the French Revolution, frankly. I'm thinking of a lot of the reforms of the early 20th century. You know, labor laws, weekends, holidays, that kind of stuff. I mean, that wasn't so much violent, but you can only push people so far until they push back, you know, until those, you know, billionaires get to their bunkers in New Zealand or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Do you remember we talked about those pimped out nuclear bunkers? And I think it was the first or second episode.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point that obviously those guys are very vulnerable because there's security people who are probably armed will probably take over the bunker and kick them out. They'll pay for it and then get kicked out by the armed people. Oh dear. Well, Matt, you know, it's been a really great chat. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add on anything we talked about, or is there anything interesting happening for you in the weeks ahead?
No, not much. Just trying to stay busy. I'm excited to sort of keep working on this podcast and take a more active role. I don't know. Are we calling me co-host or what is my
well, you're a
what is my
co-host. Yeah, of
title?
course.
Sure.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Yeah.
Co-host at
I'm
large,
excited to
you
do
know.
that. Yes. So I guess on Monday, is it after this episode release, we'll have my interview with Shane Harris. Excited about that one. Check that out. And early next month, I had another one with my good friend, a fellow indie spy writer, Stephen England. That's sort of a long, deep dive into the craft of writing spy thrillers and his inspirations and mine. And I think that'll be something good to look out to. And I have a couple ideas in the pipeline that we've discussed. So it'll be fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very exciting times ahead for the podcast. So again, thank you for your part of that. I think it's gonna be great.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's awesome to have you on. So thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for your time today. And thank you, everybody, for listening. If you are still out there, you haven't nodded off or anything like that, thank you for listening. And don't forget to check out, Matt, where can people find out more about you and your work?
So I am on Twitter still. That's at Fulton Matt, FULTONMATT, or on my website at mattfulton.net. And you can, find my novel and stuff there. And best way to find me.
Excellent. And for listeners out here, you can follow us on Twitter by just going to @SecretsAndSpies. We're also on Spoutable, which I misnamed Sproutable last episode. I don't know why I called it that, but it's called Spoutable. So we're at Secrets and Spies on Spoutable. And we have a YouTube channel. if you like this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It needs a bit of love at the moment. It's looking a bit sort of it's looking a bit dire on YouTube currently. But all the episodes are on there, and what you get on there is a nice squiggly line with a photograph of the podcast, and also you can go to our website, which is just secretsandspiespodcast.com, and you can get access to all our episodes on there, and you can share episodes that way. So again, thank you very much everybody for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.